This is actually my first event that I've done with the Center for Business and Analytics, and I'd say so far it's been really impressive, so thank you guys for having me. As Tom said today, I'll be talking a little bit about how you can create a data-driven organization, and we're going to emphasize a little bit about how the role that user empowerment really plays in that as well. So just a little bit about me. So I'm a business intelligence and analytics consultant with Thorogood. I'll tell you more about Thorogood if you don't know them, but as Tom said, I've been with Thorogood for about 8 years now, and over those 8 years I've had the opportunity to work with a number of different customers on enterprise BI implementations across a range of different technologies. I've worked quite a bit with some of our insurance and packaged goods customers, and the technologies I've probably used the most are in the Microsoft BI stack, and then things like Tableau and ClickView as well. And this session today actually has a particular kind of place in my heart because I did spend a portion of the last year helping one of our insurance organizations implement a global user empowerment program that they've used to really get their users up the curve in business intelligence and leverage some of the investments that they've made in some of those foundational pieces. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that throughout parts of the presentation, and I've got just some kind of artifacts from that at the end to show you guys just to make it a bit more tangible for you. So I'll very quickly just tell you a little bit about Thorogood because many of you may not have heard of Thorogood. Has anybody in the room heard of Thorogood before? A few nods, a few hand raises, okay. So we are an organization that specializes in business intelligence and analytics. So we have a sole focus on that area, and we work with a number of our customers to help them implement enterprise BI solutions. We've been doing this since about 1987, not me personally, but Thorogood has. And we started in London, which is where our headquarters are. Today we have offices in the US, in New York, and in Philadelphia. So I work out of the Philadelphia office. It's downtown, 20th and Market and Commerce Square, if anybody knows the area. We also have an office in Bangalore in India. Our philosophy to business intelligence really is ensuring that there's a pairing of the business understanding and technical possibilities, and that technology isn't really done just for technology's sake, but that it's done in unison with the value that businesses will get out of it. And so I think the images that Boris was showing a bit earlier about IT and the business really working together on things were ones that really resonated with us. And we use that approach in a number of different services that we help our customers with. So we do things like strategy, tool selection, but we also do implementation of business intelligence solutions, so requirements, design, implementation. And we've been helping customers a lot recently with some of the change management aspects of it too, so how they really adopt, say, a self-service culture and some of the training and empowerment things that go with it, which we'll touch on quite a bit in this session. It's just a quick look at some of the customers that we work with and across the different sectors. So we tend to draw our customers from the packaged goods, financial services, and pharmaceutical sectors. And this will just help give you a little bit of a sense of when I'm talking about some of my experiences, some of the different customers we're referring to. Some of the ones I've worked closest with are Mars, Wrigley, Liberty Mutual, General Reinsurance is one I've been working with a bit recently, Reckitt Benckiser, just to give you a bit of a sense of that. And one last point on Thorogood, we are an independent consultancy, so what that means is we partner with a number of different technologies, and you can see there are kind of some of your kind of standard platform type technologies on that top row there, more of your kind of product focused technologies in the middle, and some more kind of niche tools in the bottom, so things like Anaplan, for example. So I thought I would start off by telling you a little bit about what you can expect in this session. I read a survey recently actually that said 36% of people actually admitted to falling asleep during a corporate presentation at some point in their lives. And I thought that number probably goes up significantly when you're in the slot right before lunch. So I will do my best to not make you guys part of that statistic. If you do make it through the session, you will get lunch at the other end of it, so that's good. But hopefully you'll also be able to walk away with a little bit more information about 3 areas in particular that we think are particularly critical for creating a data-driven organization. And then 5 keys where we think successfully empowering your users can be really useful. And in that, I'll do a little bit of an example of that empowerment program that we were talking about. So I thought before talking about how to create a data-driven organization, it might be good to just spend a slide or two talking a little bit about why you may want to create a data-driven organization and what that means really. And the slide I have on the screen is from a study that we've read quite a bit and that we think is pretty interesting. It was done by MIT and Wharton, and it really looked at, the study was done back in 2011, by the way. It really looked at organizations to see if the organizations that were more data-driven were actually seeing results on the other end from productivity perspective, return on assets, and such. And these studies found that there was a pretty strong correlation between the two of them, and that relationship was a causal relationship. And I think that's an important aspect of it. So the act of having your organization be more data-driven appeared to be leading to a lot of that increased business value. And this got me laughing a little bit because thinking back to an old statistics class, they teach you about the differences between kind of correlation and causation. And so I thought, just a bit of a brief aside, the first thing they'll teach you in those classes is that correlation does not imply causation. And I think a good way to remember that is there's a website I've gone to a few times where a Harvard student essentially takes different public data sets to see where they can find data sets that are correlated that actually have no real relationship. And so I think this is just a funny example of that. So this has how Nicolas Cage films have impacted the number of people who drown in swimming pools. So just important to know that correlation and causation aren't always exactly the same thing. But in this case, they do think that that relationship is a causal one. And then this next slide is just another study that was done by the MIT Sloan Management Review, which really just kind of corroborates the findings of the prior study. So these studies were done back in 2011 and 2012. So it's been a number of years now that people have kind of really believed that there is a lot of value in creating a data-driven organization. But what we've seen is a number of our customers in particular have struggled a little bit with certain aspects of that and how you really infiltrate that kind of across your entire organization. This next slide is one that will be familiar to you. This is a slide that Gartner showed in 2013 at a summit. And this slide I find to be particularly interesting because it had a pretty resounding impact on some of our customers. And a lot of our customers actually saw this slide and felt a little bit of panic, to be honest. So I think Graham had talked a little bit about these different buckets, but what this slide essentially did was started to really categorize analytics into your descriptive analytics, diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive. And what it really, those groupings had kind of happened in the past. That wasn't something that was that earth-shattering. But what Gartner did in this one was plotted it on this scale with value and difficulty, which essentially started to kind of imply an ever-increasing value chain as you kind of move up the curve. And I think, why did our customers panic a bit when looking at this? I mean, it was clear, I think, to people that the place they wanted to be was in that top right corner. But a lot of our customers then, and even now, are still finding that they do spend a lot of time and a lot of their initiatives in this bottom left corner. And so we saw things like analytics groups popping up in every organization very quickly. You saw a lot of titles changing on LinkedIn. People who were data managers are now advanced analytics, whatnot. So we did start to see organizations kind of respond to this quite a bit. And I think I understand where Gartner was going with this very much, but I think it begs a few questions though. So first of all is, where does this descriptive actually cross this y-axis on value? Is it that there is no value in that descriptive analytics? Because for most organizations, that's really the bread and butter of their organizations. With good data and good tools, you can learn a lot from what has happened. So there's no denying that there's some value in the prescriptive analytics. I think the stuff Boris was showing was pretty earth-shattering. I thought it was very, very cool to see and very interesting. But how far apart are these things really on that scale of value, and how much should you really shift from the bottom left to the top right? And are they discrete things? So are you either here or here, or wouldn't you expect that there's a little bit more of fluidity across them? And I think the last question, the one that our customers really struggled with the most, is how do you actually organize yourselves in a way to be able to move up that chain or move up that ladder? This was in 2013. In 2014, Gartner started to introduce another principle, and this was the concept of bimodal IT. Are you guys familiar at all with the concept of bimodal IT? Have you heard this one? Some nods. What this is essentially the concept of managing two separate but coherent modes of IT delivery. So mode one is your kind of traditional IT. So it emphasizes things like scalability, security, doing things kind of efficiently and safely. And the other mode is really about more non-sequential type of activities, so emphasizing things like agility and speed. And the idea, I think, behind this, or what I think Gartner was getting at with it, is that this mode 1 really aligns quite a bit to some of that descriptive and diagnostic type analytics. So preparing your data, having good kind of organization in warehouses, whereas mode 2 starts to apply a little bit more to some of your more kind of advanced analytics, your prescriptive or your predictive analytics. And I think this was, in some ways, maybe a response to customers wondering, how do you actually move up that value chain? A way for them to start to try to suggest to them how you might organize yourself to be able to do that. And I think it's reasonably simple, I would say. But for me, this still begs that same question, which is, are these two really discrete things? So can you have your IT organization operating in such a way that some are in mode 1 and some are in mode 2, and the people making the decisions are either using mode 1 kind of data and tools or mode 2 data and tools? And so I think it's an interesting concept. When we like to think about it, though, at Thorogood, what we really like to think about is business intelligence more as a continuum rather than this kind of ever-increasing value chain. And so you still have your kind of similar concepts, so descriptive analytics, this being your productionized business intelligence, essentially, your data warehouses, your reporting on top of it. Your diagnostics, so more things, more ad hoc. You might be slicing and dicing, cutting things up a bit here, using tools like Tableau, for example. And then still having your kind of predictive and prescriptive analytics, but rather than it being a bit of a value chain, it's much more of a continuum. And what we find is that typically your user base is much broader on this descriptive side. And as you move to predictive, you get a much more niche user base. So if you're trying to find talent, people who understand the business, the data, and the statistics, that kind of intersection of the three of those is very, very difficult to find. And so typically we find in most organizations, it's not necessarily about moving up the value chain, but how do people kind of fit along this continuum? And we'll kind of use that concept as we talk about the three aspects that I think really help create data-driven decisions and how they might kind of work within a continuum like this. So what is needed to enable a data-driven organization? The first one is going to be the most obvious answer, data. No data-driven organizations without data, I would say. But this isn't just, do you have data available to you, so have you captured it? And it isn't even just, do you have it organized in, say, a data warehouse or a semantic layer? It's also about, can you have your data stored and structured in such a way that it can work with all of the different types of user needs that you have, so that it can support people throughout that entire continuum? The next thing, obviously, is the tools. And I think in most instances, the tools are an area where a lot of organizations like to start, because that's kind of the fun part, if I'm being honest. I just got done a bit of a roadmap where we were evaluating Power BI for a customer, and it's so much fun to think about the possibilities and what's coming with the technologies. And so a lot of people do start with the tools. And I don't want to say that's the easiest part, but in some ways it really kind of is. Across the two of them, I would say, is where most organizations typically do the bulk of their planning. So when they're planning for budgets and also planning for time and resource, this is where most people start. What tends to be a bit of an afterthought sometimes is the third one, which I think is really one of the most important ones, and that is the people. So if you are going down a path where you are just planning how to provision your data and how to use the tools, but you haven't thought about things like how do you train your people, how do you put processes in place that make the information kind of easy for people to find and understand, then you're really not going to get kind of that final mile with it. So we'll start off by we'll talk about those three things, but we'll start off by looking at the data a little bit. So this is the same continuum we had looked at before with your kind of broad user base and your niche user base, and again, kind of your descriptive, diagnostic, and predictive. When you start to think about the data that's needed for each of those different groups, it starts to get a little bit complex. So you might think that your broad user base for their descriptive reporting is using things like an enterprise data warehouse, so something that is structured, pretty locked down, very kind of stable and secure. And usually for this type of reporting, this type of user base, that works perfectly fine. But what you start to find is as you move down this continuum to the more kind of diagnostic, that becomes a little bit too rigid for people. So as you start doing more ad hoc BI and analytics, you might be wanting to slice and dice things in a certain way. You might want to add additional data that could be relevant. And you start to find that people typically aligned in this section might also be aligned to business initiatives that are not necessarily long-term initiatives that need answers pretty quickly. So though there's a ton of value in a data warehouse, typically it's pretty hard to get things into it quickly, and it can be a little bit rigid in these scenarios. So there's something in the middle that starts to get a bit challenging there. And then as you move down towards the other end, towards your niche user base who's doing more of that predictive stuff, it gets even more limiting because that's where you're really looking to bring in all kinds of information. So the weather data that we had talked about earlier, you might need to prepare your data in a way to be able to run algorithms on it that isn't really consistent with how you might prepare it for some of your enterprise reporting. So there starts to be some question here on how you might go about providing data to these different types of member groups. So what do we typically say about this? We talk a lot about data storage maturity models, and that could mean a few things. So as we talked about, typically we've got your enterprise data store on this side. So it's robust, it's stable. You have pretty strong processes in here. It's hard to get stuff into it, but you know that once it's in there, it is good data. As you start to move towards the middle, what we're seeing is more and more customers have what we call an agile data store. So this can be owned by IT still. In some instances, it's owned by the business, but typically we'll see it's still owned by IT. And what it is a more flexible way of storing data. It still has some process and some kind of commitment to quality, but not nearly as locked down or as hard as the enterprise data storage is. So it's a little bit less assured quality, but you get to put things in there a lot quicker. You might not have to move things through as many environments or go through kind of as many hoops to get it in there. And what it really is it allows you the opportunity to get to prove the value of some of that data that you might need pretty quickly to be able to address some of the initiatives that are happening in the business. And then on the other end, even more kind of extreme than that, is kind of this concept of an ad hoc data storage. Typically, this is owned by a business user or individuals, and it's almost throwaway in a sense. So it might be pulling in weather data to see if it's important, or pulling in traffic information, trying to really prove out the value of it, preparing it in such a way that it is kind of aligned to what you want to do from a mathematical or statistical model perspective. And the idea of this isn't that you've now got kind of three separate areas, but that there's a lot of interplay between these as well. So as you start to find something of value in that ad hoc data storage, if you find that weather patterns are particularly valuable, you may start to move it back into your agile data store. So you may now put it in control of IT. You might put some processes around it that allow it to be a bit more automated, that improve the quality of it. And over time, you might start to find things in your agile data store as you prove out different business initiatives that become valuable enough to get into the kind of line to go into your enterprise data warehouse. So it's really kind of thinking about the continuum that kind of happens here and the way that information can flow really from one side of it over to the other. And the last bit of this is that in having these three separate kind of storage modes, it could get kind of confusing for users. So in some scenarios, it may be important for them to know where information comes from one and where it comes from another. But in others, you may want to abstract that from them. And so you can use some elements of, say, semantic layers that can bridge these different storages so that to the users it all seems seamless, but under the hood, there's a little bit more kind of structure to it. When we start to think about the tools, I think it's interesting to think about kind of what we call the old model for tools. And a lot of these tools are still around and are used very successfully today. But what we found even 10 years ago is that a lot of tools are segregated into pretty separate buckets. So for your broad user base, they would typically be using things like business objects, Cognos, reporting services from Microsoft, so things that are a bit more kind of structured. Then in your analysis bin, you might have things like TM1, Hyperion cubes, or Excel, one that we're all pretty familiar with, where you can kind of do analysis. And then your kind of niche user base using tools like SAS and SPSS. What we've seen recently, though, over the last few years, is that there's really been a merge of these technologies, where the technologies are no longer looking to just kind of fit into one bucket, but rather to offer things for the users that kind of span across all of these. So you may see a tool like Tableau, for example, which is very, very good at analysis. Are you guys familiar with Tableau? Yep, a lot of nods. Very good at analysis. And one of their initiatives has really been building in some of the statistical components into Tableau. So it's not, as advanced as using SAS, for example, but you can do some linear regression in there. You can integrate R code into it. Same thing with Power BI, so one of the newer tools from Microsoft. Again, people familiar with Power BI? So I'm really looking to do the whole kind of gamut of things. So being able to do some more kind of fixed reporting on it. Good for analysis, maybe not as good as Tableau analysis, but good for analysis. And really starting to have some interesting integration with R. So Microsoft, you guys will probably know, had acquired Revolution Analytics and started to really incorporate R quite a bit into the SQL 2016. What we're seeing is, in Power BI actually, the ability to have a visualization that executes R script against data sets that are created within Power BI. So you're starting to see the tools really kind of combine quite a bit and consolidate, and to really offer users the ability to do a range of activities. And so your environment is starting to look a little bit more like these flexible tools on top of your more flexible data storage. And the last point about this is on people. So there is a lot of value in shifting people up the continuum. So moving people from your broad user base to your niche user base. They'll probably never be even buckets. But there is a lot of value in pushing people up that way. And the evolution of tools is definitely making that a lot easier. So where you might have needed to know a lot more to do analysis prior, a lot of the tools now are pretty user-friendly. So being able to get people from that broad user base into this more analysis bucket is getting easier and easier. As they start to integrate some statistical capabilities in those tools, even starting to move them this way a little bit is getting a bit easier. And that can really be amplified by investing in user empowerment, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. The other thing that's a bit interesting with this, though, is that you also want to consider the ways that you can kind of feed the value back down the loop as well. So something that we've seen a lot of customers do is consider how do you take some of the statistics or predictive analytics that you're doing and start to embed that back into more structured or productionized BI. So if what your niche user base is doing over there is very valuable and interesting, you want to find a way to kind of push it back down so that it can be repeatable and other people can report off of it and understand it. And same thing with your analysts in the middle here. So as they're finding relationships that are really interesting in the data, you want the ability to then bring that back into more of your structured reporting. So it's not necessarily a discrete bucket. There is kind of movement in both directions. An example of this, and this is a pretty simple example, but we're working for a packaged goods customer who was particularly interested in looking at their energy output. And there were some initiatives around reducing their energy consumption in their factories. They needed to reduce it by 3% each year. And there was one guy who was essentially responsible for forecasting, based on the production volumes in each of the factories and a series of other factors, what would their energy consumption be within that plant. And he was responsible for making sure kind of that everybody could stay within their thresholds. And so he probably maybe wasn't full towards the end, but he's probably somewhere here in the spectrum. And he was doing it very manually for each different factory and then each different product line as well. It was taking him quite a bit of time. A project that we worked on with him was to really take that type of logic. We ended up, it's really just a reasonably simple kind of linear regression he was doing. But we built that into an R script and allowed the tools that they were using down here, his broader user base, to essentially execute his R script by passing in different production volumes. So if they thought their production volume was going to increase by 50,000, they could make that change and see what their forecast would be based off of the work that he had done. So there's really a lot of value in making sure that things are kind of being passed back down the chain as well. So just a little bit of a summary so far. So the data, we need to provide the data, and they need to be in appropriate structures really kind of for all the user needs. From a tools perspective, they're evolving. They're becoming much more flexible and adaptive. And so it's really important to kind of select the right ones that will meet the needs of your kind of varying user groups. I still don't think we're at a point or will be at a point where organizations are using one tool. I would say most of the organizations we use have multiple tools, sometimes multiple tools just for reporting and just for analytics. But the tools are getting a lot better at being able to meet multiple needs. And then the last one really is the key, so the people. So the tools and data alone aren't going to create any value in the organization. It's really the people that are going to do that. And so emphasizing kind of their needs and what it is that you have to do to get them to create that value, I think is really important. So the kind of key takeaway from this part is that really all three of these things are required in order to be able to empower your users. And that's what we're really going to look at in the second part of this presentation is how can you actually go about creating an environment where users are empowered to create value. So this is a slide just to illustrate a little bit. So what we see is a lot of our customers do make that initial investment in technology. So in the data and in the tools. And then throughout the process, they'll usually have some users who are using it with varying skill levels. And on the other side of it, you're getting some valuable insights in the organization. But what we found is a lot of our customers have come to us and said, the investment that we made in the technology, when we had done that, we kind of envisioned it being a little bit grander on the other end, or we thought we would get more out of it. And in many ways, the insights that you get on the other side are just going to be a product of the skill level and the users and the number of users that you have kind of supported to access the data sets that you create or the reports that you create. So there's a lot of value in kind of being able to shift people up that. This led us to a pretty interesting conversation with a number of our customers, and I like this question a lot because there's not an easy way to answer it. It's not that easy to quantify it, but we like talking to our customers quite a bit about what the value of a power user actually is to them. So what a lot of our customers have asked for is that they all know that they want more power users, they want them to be more confident, and they want them to be better enabled. But when you start to get into discussions within organizations about why they want that, it gets pretty interesting. And there are typically two kind of common things. So the first is that, with more power users, more confident power users, you have the awareness of opportunities more. So you're learning things about your data and about your business. And the effect of that will likely be to reduce costs or to drive revenue, things that will help propel the company, propel the business further, making those kind of better and faster decisions. But a lot of organizations also recognize something kind of on the other axis, and that's a reduced dependence on IT and the associated costs with that. So for many organizations, it's been difficult for IT to prioritize some of that critical activity. So when they were feeling they're kind of stuck in the bottom left and want to be doing things in that top right there, some of it is just about being able to get to all of the things that are in their backlog or to keep up with the user demand and doing things that are somewhat generic to them, creating reports, provisioning data. So the more and more you can empower users, the more their dependence on IT goes down, and the more you can kind of reprioritize IT on focusing on the things that are going to be pretty valuable and a little bit more like progressive. Something else we talked about a bit with our customers are where are the elements that drive decision making coming from today? So if you think of this black box really as being every need that a business could possibly have, what a lot of people were saying is that technical experts in the organization were really fulfilling a large portion of that. They were creating the objects that were driving decision making. And business experts were creating a much smaller portion of that. And most people, when asked this question, would think just about those two aspects of it. But it's pretty interesting to think about what's happening on the right-hand side here. So in this scenario, there's a very large amount of latent needs. So needs that are unmet. And they could be unmet for a number of different reasons. So it could be that they're sitting in an IT backlog, things that people have asked for that IT just hasn't been able to get to yet. Or they could also be needs that the business doesn't actually know that they need yet. So things that could be valuable for them, but they haven't recognized it because they haven't been able to quite see it. When we've asked our customers where they want them to come from, the obvious answer is that they want more and more to come from the business experts. You'll still have your technical experts providing a good bit of information, provisioning data, but it'll be a smaller portion. The impact of that, though, is that while this reduces, it also reduces the latent needs. Because you have more people from the business kind of creating and filling those requests. And you also have them becoming more and more aware of the things that are available to them and the things that might be valuable to their business. So how would you actually go about doing this? I think looking at boxes on a slide, it seems, if you could do it that easily, that would be great. But what we found is quite a bit has to kind of be considered when you go about empowering users. And the 4 areas, I think, that we've kind of grouped them into are foundational learning. So how do you teach them about the data and the tools, give them the foundation that they need? How do you then apply that learning? So once they've learned it, how do you ensure that they continue learning it, that they're applying it properly and correctly? And how do you do all of that in an environment where best practices and community are kind of propelling them forward? They're doing things responsibly and in a very supported way. And so I'll take you through kind of 5 kind of key points of things that you should consider with user empowerment. And we do have quite a bit, we have some other workshops that we've done or webcasts that we've done on the topic as well. So if you're interested in a bit more detail on this, just let me know. I'm happy to kind of point you in that direction. But this is kind of a summarization of some of the learnings that we've had throughout this. So the first one is that making it real really helps with adoption. So if you think about your traditional training, when you go to teach users how to use tools, typically it's on a sample set of data, and it's often for one technology. So you might go and get, say, Tableau training or Click training. What we found works a lot better is when your training becomes much more bespoke. So when you're doing it on the user's actual data sets, when it's much more custom to their needs, and when it's on the combination of technologies that are available to them. The other thing that's very important is that sometimes we see customers looking to train people just on their data and then just in the tools. And the segregation of the two, I think, makes it very difficult for them to kind of understand how you really would use it in a real-life scenario. So the more real you can make that training, and the more you can couple your data training with your tool training, I think the more and more valuable it is for a number of users. The next kind of point is that you need support when you need support. And this point really came from a conversation that I was having with a gentleman at a chemical manufacturing company who had just purchased Tableau, and it was being used kind of like wildfire, except that he said he kind of has just 2 different types of users. One who took the training and the next day really had no idea where to get started with it and said, I forget how to start and I'm done. And another group of users who would get maybe 80% of the way through anything that they wanted to do, hit a roadblock, not be able to know how to do a custom calculation or to do some formatting, and kind of call it quits at that point. And so in that conversation with him, I think something that became very apparent to me is that users will need support in that very moment where they need support, similar to kind of a GPS device. When you go off track, you need somebody immediately to be able to kind of redirect you back in. And so something that we've used for some of our customers is a concept of live support, or what we call kind of on-demand coaching. So hours set aside that when users do have any type of questions, they can schedule a coaching session and be able to talk to somebody who can actually understand their data and their tool and kind of get them through it. Another thing we've seen, we've worked on with some of our customers is the concept of on-demand knowledge centers. So you may not want to talk to a person, you may just be able to get the answer from something on demand. So for the example that I'll show you after this, we essentially had an entire, it was done on SharePoint, but a portal that posted all of the trainings that users had gone through, a ton of documentation on it, any community materials in one place so that people have a place to go when they do get stuck. The next one is that it's a journey, and so what we found is that not every user is going to be the same. Not every user is going to take the same path to training. Not everyone wants it to be live, not everybody wants it to be on demand. And people, not everyone will need to kind of go all the way with it. So in the example that I'll show you, we had some users who were just kind of classified as business users. They had a certain level of training, and it was enough to kind of get them by. Then if they wanted to engage in more classes, do more of that ad hoc, kind of move towards the middle of that continuum we were looking at, they would go on the power user track. So once you've completed business user, you've got an option of kind of taking some more advanced courses, all the way through to some of your more expert users who are doing things like actually modeling data and publishing to like larger groups of users. So I think it's important to remember that it is a journey. It's not going to be just a 1 or 2 week training and you turn it on and expect that everybody just gets it. It will take some people a while, and their paths will all be slightly different with it. So everything is better with company. And the organizations where we've seen self-service and BI really flourish are the ones that have pretty strong communities around them. So one customer of ours in particular, a health insurance company, has a very, very strong following for one of the technologies they implement. And they have user groups that meet and active blogs. finding a way to get the people within the organization excited about it and wanting to create things in it, I think is really helpful to having it really flourish. It also creates a number of experts within the organization that they can go to. So if me and my coworker are working on something similar and I'm seeing him presented at, say, a user group, I know that he's somebody in the organization that I can go to get that information. So where it's possible to create communities, I think it's very, very important. And the last one here is just that responsibility really is required. So with many of these tools, it is a bit of a change. The Power BI tool I was just looking at, actually, we were looking at the cloud offering for it, which really offers users pretty unparalleled amounts of autonomy. It's pretty earth-shattering, I would say, some of the functionality there. But with that comes some risks. So do you want your users to be able to do just about anything? The concept of ensuring that users are using things responsibly is very important. And what we found is a good way to do that is to ensure that that's kind of baked into any kind of training or empowerment program throughout, so that they know kind of along the way things like how they use the tools responsibly, what data they can pull, how it works together, but also things like user experience. So a lot of times things like as simple as branding or the user interface are kind of overlooked in those training programs, and that really does go a very long way for getting users adopted on a tool and using it properly. So those are kind of 5 key points. I think a way to kind of make it a little bit more tangible for you is to show you a little bit about a case study that we did. This was done for a global insurance company. And what we did was a few different areas of this. So we had enrollment and assessment. So during this phase, we essentially defined a curriculum. We set an enrollment strategy. So that's also very important. How do you get the right people into it? Do they sign up? Are they selected? And we also talked a little bit about some user assessment there. So how do you assess the users coming into it to find out kind of where on the path they are? Then moving more towards foundational learning. This is where they were having live training sessions. We ended up doing them for this customer virtually because it was a global organization. And they ranged from basic to intermediate, so a number of different paths that users could take. And I would say these, well, I'll show you a sample of the curriculum, but I think we ended up doing about 18 different topics. Some users just doing kind of 3 topics, some users going all the way through to the end. We also put an emphasis on continued learning. So with this, we established an on-demand knowledge center, so something like that SharePoint site I showed you. We implemented real-time coaching support. So for a series of months after the foundational training, just having people on call to be able to help people as they started actually really applying the learning, doing things in real life with it. And we looked to include that all in a community and in best practices. So we set up a community, we had user-based events, we had a blog and email groups that were going out, newsletters. And from a best practices perspective, we had specific courses that they needed to attend. So in order to be able to publish for other people to see, for example, you needed to ensure that you had been in the visualization best practices course so that you couldn't just publish anything out there that you wanted. To have certain levels of permissions, you had to pass the QA and standards courses. So you can really use those best practices as a way to ensure that you're kind of getting like checking boxes before users are able to have the types of permissions that they would want to have. And I just pulled a couple things from this program just to give you a little bit more of a sense of what one might look like. So at the end of this program, and this one lasted about 9 months, and it was for about 160 users, we looked at, we had 160 business users who had taken kind of 4 courses to get that business user certification. We had advanced users who were taking 8 courses in addition to the business courses. And then power users who were taking 8 more courses than these guys, and expert users who would take 2 more than that. So you can see a little bit about the distribution. And you can also see with the coloring, actually you might not because that coloring's not that great, but the green are people who started the course but didn't necessarily complete all 4 of them. So you will see that even though you kind of define these different groupings, it is possible that somebody goes to the first 2 of these, gets everything that they need, and really doesn't have to finish. In some instances, that might be okay. They may have gotten what they need out of it, and it might be sufficient. This was a sample of the curriculum, and it did change a little bit. I think it ended up being about 18 courses. But what we looked to do is really plot the courses across different technologies and different types of users. So you'll actually see we had business users and power users. We actually ended up splitting it out into 4 groups. But we also implemented a train-the-trainer concept to it. So throughout the whole thing, we had 2 people at the end. We had about 160 people in total, and about 2 at the end who were trainers that could then go and train the rest of the organization. And so they're actually in the process now of starting to run the second run of this, where these 2 trainers will lead a majority of the training rather than having us need to do it. So it was meant to be kind of able to be continued in that manner. And then this last one I have is just a user feedback summary. So something else that's pretty important is just making sure you're understanding the users throughout. It won't be the same in any one scenario. And so what we would do is after each course, we would require that people fill out a survey. And we were getting pretty interesting and candid responses. We would also ask them, what kind of feedback do you have for improving things that could be incorporated before the next kind of run of training to see how things increase. And we would look at these slides every week, both with IT and with the business, to ensure that they were kind of happy with people's responses to things. I will say what you can tell from this one is, in general, it was pretty good. The area that was probably the most challenging is to have the content and the pace appropriate. And that was because regardless of how many kind of tracks you create, some people will say, the very interesting part of this is that some of the people said the pace was too fast, and many of them said it was too slow. And so 76 actually we ended up being pretty happy with, but it did take a little bit of tinkering to figure out how do you really separate these user groups to be able to work for all of them. And we did find that the on-demand content was pretty helpful for the people who thought it was too fast. The people who thought it was too slow, we ended up deciding that if they chose to skip a course, you could skip that course. So just some interesting things to consider there. So that's about all I've got. Just some key takeaways from the whole session, and then if there are any questions, happy to answer them, or happy to answer them over lunch if people want. The merits of creating a data-driven organization are being demonstrated in many forums. We're seeing many studies of it, but it is a challenging thing for a lot of organizations to take on. So if you are looking at that Gartner scale and thinking, oh no, I'm in the bottom left, don't panic too much. A lot of people still are, and there is a lot of value there. And it's, it is a bit of a progression to be able to do some more of those top right activities. In terms of enabling a data-driven organization, it really requires harmony across those data tools and people. So I think that's something that's pretty important to remember, not focusing on any one of them, because a failure on any part really will be pretty challenging. And then the last one is just that the return on your investment in the data and in the tools is really only going to be a product of the extent to which you're able to empower your users to use them well and use them wisely. So considering how you might go about empowering users in your organization, I think is a pretty important thought. And I think that's all. Yep, that's all I have. Any questions? Yep.
I saw the different industries that you spoke about. I didn't see education in those categories.
Mm-hmm.
Can you touch on where do you see education falling currently, and have you seen any transitions in terms of where you see it going in relation to business and military?
Sure. I'll be very candid about it. We honestly, the bulk of our customers really draw from those industries. We don't do a ton in the public sector, so I'm not sure I'd be as well placed to kind of say education in particular how that is changing. I mean, I would imagine the changes in the tools and whatnot will all apply to education as well, so long as they're adopting them. I know with Tableau, for example, we'll go to a number of conferences, and a number of people from education organizations talk pretty heavily about using that. So I imagine tools may be pretty similar. So where we're seeing a lot of the kind of combining and functionality there may also apply, but not an area that I'm particularly knowledgeable in.